In a courtroom teeming with quiet tension, Judge Marcus let out a sharp sigh as he addressed the young woman standing before him. His voice was measured but firm. "Miss Angela White, this court has neither the time nor patience for your antics. You've gone too far." Angela stood silent, her chin held high, her eyes steady. The weight of his words didn't seem to faze her, though anyone watching closely could see the subtle twitch of her fingers. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to plead. She was there because she had no choice. What she carried, what she was prepared to reveal, wasn't about saving herself. It was about saving someone else. Judge Marcus's words echoed through the room, but his mind was elsewhere. Just hours earlier, he had been pulled into the kind of crisis no parent ever expects. His son, his pride, his legacy, had made a grave mistake. The details were still a blur, but the consequences loomed large, threatening to destroy the future he had worked so hard to build for his child. As he sat there, his stern exterior masking his turmoil, he had no idea that the woman he was reprimanding held the key to everything he desperately needed. Angela knew the stakes all too well. She had spent months putting pieces together, digging through shadows most people would avoid, and following leads that had nearly cost her everything. What she had uncovered wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. But the truth has a way of demanding its day, and Angela had decided it would come today. She hadn't stepped into that courtroom to defend herself. She had walked in prepared to risk it all for a truth that couldn't stay buried. For those watching, Angela might have seemed reckless, even arrogant. But if they had known what she knew, if they had seen what she had uncovered, they would have understood the resolve that kept her standing there, shoulders back, gaze unwavering, despite the weight of judgment coming down on her. Before we go further, I want to pause and thank you. Whether you're joining us from a bustling metropolis or the quiet comfort of your home, your presence here matters. Sharing these stories isn't just about what happens next, it's about connecting with you. If you're drawn to this journey, I'd appreciate it if you liked, shared, and subscribed to this channel. Your support is what helps us bring these stories to light. And trust me, this one is going to stay with you long after it ends. The courthouse stood as a silent witness to countless battles of justice and law. Its towering facade of marble and steel reflected the pale winter sun, an unspoken reminder of the weight carried within its walls. Inside, the air buzzed with a kind of restrained urgency, a mixture of clacking shoes against tiled floors, hushed conversations, and the occasional bark of an officer keeping order. At the heart of it all was Judge Marcus, seated in his high-backed chair, a symbol of authority and control. Known throughout the city for his sharp wit and unwavering adherence to the law, he was not a man to tolerate nonsense. His piercing eyes scanned the room like a seasoned chess player analyzing his next move. He had built a career on discipline and structure, and nothing, not chaos, not disorder, was allowed to disrupt the sanctity of his courtroom. Yet today, his composed exterior masked the turmoil brewing within. His son's arrest had thrown his personal life into disarray, an irony not lost on him. The man who presided over justice for others now found himself at the mercy of a system he could not manipulate. Marcus wrestled with questions that had no answers. Was there anything he could have done to prevent this? Could he have been a better father? These were thoughts he would never utter aloud, yet they clawed at the edges of his mind. Angela White, on the other hand, was an entirely different force in the room. She was young, fiercely intelligent, and relentless in her pursuit of justice. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, she exuded professionalism, though a careful observer might have noticed a slight tremor in her hands when she adjusted her papers. Angela had carved a reputation for herself as a public defender who fought not for fame, but for fairness. But Angela wasn't in this courtroom to merely argue another case. She had spent weeks navigating a labyrinth of clues and whispers, leading her to uncover a story far more complex than it first appeared. A story that connected her client, Judge Marcus's son, and a chain of events that would challenge the very foundation of justice the judge so fiercely protected. The tension was palpable as Angela cleared her throat, preparing to speak. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She glanced briefly at the judge, whose stern gaze bore into her, then at the jury, who looked back with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. What she was about to reveal would change the course of this case, and possibly the lives of everyone in the room. Angela began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Your Honor, with all due respect, this isn't just about my client. This is about a much bigger truth, one that's been overlooked for too long. Judge Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. He was a man accustomed to control, and this moment felt as though it were slipping from his grasp. You're treading a fine line, Ms. White, he warned, his voice low but firm. Angela didn't waver. Perhaps, she replied, her words carrying a weight that hinted at the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. But sometimes, the line is the only place where the truth can be seen clearly. Her statement hung in the air, unanswered but undeniable. The room seemed frozen, every eye fixed on her. What did she mean by a bigger truth? What was she holding back? It was a moment designed to keep viewers at the edge of their seats, yearning to know what would come next. As the camera metaphorically pans back, let me ask you, dear viewers, what would you do if you were in Angela's shoes? Would you risk everything to reveal the truth, even if it meant standing alone? Or would you take the safer path, knowing the cost might be too high? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonates with you, please like and share. It's your support that keeps stories like this alive. Don't go anywhere, because what Angela has uncovered will shake everything you thought you knew about justice. Angela's voice cut through the room, measured yet brimming with emotion. Your Honor, what I am presenting here is not just about this case, it's about a life, a future, and the integrity of this courtroom. Her words hung in the air like an unanswered challenge. She had poured hours into preparing for this moment, combing through evidence, building a defense that no one wanted to hear. Now, standing under the weight of Judge Marcus's scrutiny, she couldn't afford to falter. Judge Marcus leaned forward, his expression hard as stone. Miss Angela, I've already warned you once. If you cannot present your arguments clearly and concisely, you are wasting this court's time. His tone was clipped, bordering on impatience. His reputation for control was well known, and he wasn't about to let a young public defender derail the proceedings. He tapped his pen lightly against the bench, signaling his growing frustration. Angela paused, closing her eyes briefly as if summoning strength from within. Her client, sitting silently at the defense table, shifted nervously in his chair. The stakes were impossibly high. If Angela failed, the consequences would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls, and her client's life would be forever altered. I understand your time is valuable, Your Honor, Angela said finally, her voice steady, though her clenched fists betrayed the storm she was holding back. But the truth I am about to present is not only relevant, it is critical. Spectators in the gallery leaned forward, their murmurs growing louder. A woman in the back row whispered something to her companion, who nodded in agreement. Even the bailiff exchanged a glance with his colleague, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Every eye in the room was on Angela now, including those of the jury, who had been silent observers until this moment. Angela took a step closer to the bench, her movements deliberate. This case is not just about facts and figures, it's about the humanity behind those facts. And when humanity is ignored, justice is lost. Judge Marcus's expression tightened, but he didn't interrupt this time. There was something in Angela's tone, a quiet conviction that commanded attention, even from a man as disciplined and unyielding as him. Angela's client, a young man barely out of his teens, lowered his gaze, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His life had become a question mark, his future hanging by a thread. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air heavy with anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Angela continued, now turning to face them. What you're about to hear may challenge what you believe, but I ask only one thing, listen. Listen not with judgment, but with fairness. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't fit neatly into expectations. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Angela's plea had planted a seed, a question that now lingered in the room. What truth was she so desperate to reveal? Judge Marcus finally spoke, his voice sharp. "Miss Angela, this is your last chance. Present your evidence, or I will dismiss this line of argument." Angela's heart raced, but she met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Very well, Your Honor. If I may approach the bench," she asked, her words calm but carrying the weight of her resolve. The judge gestured impatiently. "Proceed." Angela moved forward, carrying a file that seemed to pulse with the promise of something monumental. Whatever was inside would either make or break her case, and she knew it. As she placed it on the judge's desk, the room seemed to hold its breath. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Spectators filled the seats, some out of curiosity, others drawn by the magnetic tension surrounding the case. Judge Marcus entered, his usual commanding presence tempered by a newfound introspection. His gaze swept the room before resting on Angela, who was seated at the defense table, reviewing her notes with a quiet intensity. When the session began, Angela rose to deliver her closing arguments. Her voice carried a confidence honed by determination, yet there was an underlying vulnerability that gave her words an undeniable authenticity. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone steady, "what we decide here today is not just about my client. It is about fairness, about believing in the potential for redemption when the evidence shows it's deserved." She paused, looking directly at the jury, her expression earnest. "We all make mistakes. But if we are unwilling to see beyond them, to give people the opportunity to grow and rebuild, what kind of justice are we serving? What kind of humanity are we preserving?" The room was silent, every ear tuned to her words. Even Judge Marcus, who had often heard such arguments before, found himself leaning forward slightly, absorbing the sincerity in her voice. It was as though she had cast aside the barriers of formality, speaking not as a lawyer but as someone deeply invested in the lives her work touched. Angela continued, weaving the evidence and the human story behind it into a compelling plea for justice. Her words resonated, not just as facts, but as a reminder of the deeper purpose of the courtroom itself. When she finished, the air felt heavy with anticipation. She returned to her seat, exhaling softly as she sat down. Her client, visibly nervous, whispered a quiet thank you, his gratitude evident even in the small gesture. Judge Marcus sat back in his chair, his face thoughtful. For the first time in years, he hesitated before speaking. His fingers brushed the edge of the gavel, but instead of delivering the usual swift judgment, he addressed the courtroom in a measured tone. "Miss Angela," he began, his voice steady but carrying a note of humility. "Yesterday, I questioned your approach. I was critical of your persistence and your methods. But today, I have seen not only your professionalism but your dedication to justice. You have reminded us all of what this courtroom should stand for." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "And for my earlier judgment of your work, I owe you an apology." The courtroom held its breath for a moment before erupting into applause. Spectators stood, some clapping enthusiastically, others nodding in quiet admiration. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, couldn't hide a small smile. Angela's client sat stunned, his expression shifting from disbelief to joy as he realized what this meant. The jury had deliberated quickly, and the outcome was clear: he had been acquitted. The young man's face crumpled with relief, tears welling in his eyes as Angela reached over to clasp his hand briefly, her own expression a mix of pride and quiet triumph. Judge Marcus looked out at the room, his own face softened in a way that those who had worked with him for years had rarely seen. In that moment, the man known for his strict discipline appeared almost vulnerable. He struck the gavel, signaling the conclusion of the case, but the echoes of that moment would linger far longer than the sound itself. As the courtroom began to empty, Angela gathered her things, her hand steady despite the emotional weight of what had just occurred. She glanced back once at Judge Marcus, who offered her a small nod, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement that needed no words. Now let me ask you, dear viewers, how often do we take the time to look beyond someone's exterior to truly understand their story? Would you have had the courage to stand your ground as Angela did, knowing the odds were against you? Or would you have doubted yourself under pressure? As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of applause faded, the weight of the day lingered. Angela walked out with her client, her steps steady but her mind reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She knew this victory wasn't just about the case, it was about proving that perseverance and belief in doing what is right could still prevail in a world often quick to dismiss such ideals. Judge Marcus stayed behind in his chambers, the day's events replaying in his mind. He had always prided himself on being a man of discipline and structure, but today, he had been reminded of something far greater, the strength of humility. It wasn't easy to admit when you were wrong, especially not in front of a crowded room. But acknowledging Angela's brilliance and dedication had been necessary. It was a step toward not just repairing his view of her, but also toward re-examining his role as a gatekeeper of justice. Weeks later, the impact of that case continued to resonate. Judge Marcus began spending more time mentoring young lawyers, not just on the technicalities of the law, but on the ethics and humanity that should underpin every decision. He shared lessons born from his decades on the bench, but more importantly, he shared the humility he had learned from Angela. Angela, meanwhile, had not slowed down. She continued to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, carrying with her the lessons she had learned in that courtroom. The victory had given her not just confidence, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Each case was a chance to make a difference, not just in the lives of her clients, but in the system itself. In a world quick to judge, the narrator reflects, we are often reminded of the strength of humility and the courage it takes to stand firm in the face of adversity. Angela's unwavering determination changed more than the outcome of a case. It touched lives, opened minds, and left a legacy of fairness and respect. The final scene shows Angela walking down the courthouse steps, the sun setting behind her. Across town, Judge Marcus addresses a group of young attorneys, his voice steady but filled with the conviction of someone who understands the importance of every choice they'll make in their careers. Respect. Fairness. Understanding. These are the pillars of true justice, the narrator concludes. They are the values that bring meaning to the law and purpose to the lives of those who uphold it. What about you, viewers? How do you define justice in your own life? Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for what's right seemed impossible? Share your thoughts below, and if this story has touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep the conversation going, because justice, at its heart, is about people, and people like you make all the difference.